So today's episode is going to be a little different than the recent ones. It likely won't feel as pretty and polished as I usually try and make them, and it will probably feel a bit rushed in some areas. But nonetheless, what we're doing today is some of the most important work I've done to the E36 so far in regards to getting it ready to head to the track, so buckle in. It's going to be a weird but fun episode. Here we go. Now, as you can see, we're not exactly at home for this round of mods. Instead, I decided to save myself the headache and borrow some space from my work to be able to get the E36 in the air so I could have better access to get this round of parts installed without the difficulty of working on my back in the garage at home. The reason being is because today I'm not only going to be replacing several bushings at the rear end of the car, but while everything is apart, I'm also going to be prepping and eventually welding in reinforcement plates for the rear trailing arm pockets. And don't worry if you're unfamiliar with why that's necessary. I'll go over that in a bit more detail later in the episode. For now, let's start removing the old worn out bushings. Since deciding that the E36 was going to be built as a track-capable street car, I've been really eager to dial in the car, and one way I've been prepping to do that is with all new spherical bushings anywhere I could think to put them. I figured if I was going to need to replace the old worn out bushings, that it was worth spending a few extra dollars to buy better performing parts, since I'd likely have done that at some point in the future anyways. And so what I'm doing here is removing the old, presumably OEM, upper and lower outer control arm bushings for some Rogue Engineering spherical bushings. And in case anyone else is interested, you could buy these from Rogue Engineering themselves. You're going to need 2 sets, as each set only comes with 2 bushings, and there are 4 in total, 2 for each side. I'll make sure to link them in the description below. Now, alongside those, I'm also going to be replacing the rear trailing arm bushings with SPL spherical bushings. Again, I'll link them in the description below. Now, these in particular, I was really excited to change out because since buying the M3 almost 2 years ago, I've had a really loud thumping noise when driving in and out of driveways and over bumps, and I've long since suspected that it was the rear trailing arm bushings that were the culprit. I also mentioned in the last episode after installing the KW coilovers that I had a hopping condition coming from the rear end when hard accelerating, and one of my theories as to why was because of the old worn out bushings in the rear end. And as you can see here, these bushings were in serious need of replacement. And believe it or not, this isn't even the worst one. Wait until we get to the other side. So at this point, the old bushings on the driver's side were officially replaced. All the old rubber is out and we have brand new, fresh spherical bearings in their place. And now before bolting the trailing arm back into place, I can start prepping the surface of the trailing arm pocket so we can have a nice and prepped surface for when I start welding in the reinforcement plates. After about 10 to 15 minutes with a fresh 3M bristle pad, I was able to work through the majority of the body sealer and then mock up the reinforcement plate that I picked up from Garagistic to start to get an idea for what it's going to look like once the plates are welded in permanently. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'd explain a bit more in depth as to what these are and why they're necessary. Now, similar to nearly every other significant contact point for the suspension on these cars, the rear trailing arm pockets have been known to develop cracks under hard driving conditions like on track or when drifting, and in the worst case can rip out entirely. And so because this car at some point will be making high-speed turns at the track, the last thing I want to have happen is the pocket ripping out mid-turn and causing a significant crash. So for less than $50 and a few hours of prep, practice, and actual weld work, I can significantly increase the strength of these pockets and the likelihood that I don't end up in a worst-case situation. Knock on wood, of course. So now that the driver's side is finished, minus the weld work, we can move on to the passenger side. And of course, this is simply a rinse and repeat of the driver's side, but I figured instead of talking through the process and what we're doing, this time I could talk to you more so about how I'm doing the work, as I think it could help some of you who will eventually take on these projects yourselves. Now, when I originally went into this project, I had initially planned on removing the trailing arm entirely so I could use my Works pneumatic press to remove and install the bushings, but I realized that I'd have to remove the parking brake components and I simply didn't feel like going through that, so instead I opted to give my coworker's bearing press tool a try, and as you saw with the driver's side, thankfully it was enough to get the job done. Now, I'm not 100% sure what brand tool I use, but you can buy pretty much the exact same kit from Amazon for less than $50. So not a bad deal for the DIYers out there taking on this job, but I do want to warn anyone who is considering this method. If you haven't spotted it yet, I did have to bend the dust shield pretty significantly to make room for the tool to fit with the right pieces, which wouldn't have been the case had I removed the trailing arm to press the bushings out. And normally it wouldn't even be such a big deal, except in the E36's case, the parking brake components are secured directly to the dust shield, which means when the job is all said and done, there's a good chance you'll have to spend some time to not only readjust the parking brake shoes to even be able to refit the rotors, but also bend the dust shield back so the rotors don't make contact when they're spinning. And trust me, I learned this the hard way on the driver's side. Now, do you remember when I said that the driver's side rear trailing arm bushing wasn't even the bad side? Well, let's look at what I found when taking the passenger side out. Yeah, I think I was onto something when I suspected the bad rear end bushings were causing the noises and the hopping around, but we'll see when I get around to doing a test drive once all this work is done. Thankfully, after having learned how this process goes on the driver's side, the passenger side went a bit smoother, and once everything was finished, prepped, and reinstalled, we could see the aftermath of what came out from the rear end. Now, just as sort of a disclaimer, this entire job is simply the way I decided to do it. It worked for me this time, but it may not work for you. And remember, I work on cars for a living, and this is also my own personal car. So I'm willing to make mistakes if they do happen to occur. So air hammering the bushings out and hand wrenching the bushings back in were all methods that I personally was comfortable with. So take these approaches at your own risk. If you're not comfortable, then definitely have someone else do it. The last thing I'd want is to be blamed for a mistake that was unintentionally made if you decided to do this job in a similar way. Now at this point, the only thing left was to actually weld in the reinforcement plates. But there's a small problem. I don't really know how to weld. But in preparation for this specific job of reinforcing the rear trailing arm bushing pockets, I've spent maybe a grand total of 2 to 3 hours using a MIG welder at my work. But unfortunately, those few hours I spent practicing happened probably close to 9 months ago. So all that to say, before I go and risk blowing holes through my car, I spent probably close to another 3 to 5 hours over the last week practicing on some scrap metal just to try to get any sort of experience before I go and actually weld onto my car. Now, obviously, compared to anyone who actually knows what they're doing with a welder, I still know next to nothing. I have arguably still zero experience compared to any proficient welder, and I know there's a good chance that I could really mess something up. But after a few pointers from a coworker who actually does know how to weld and applying those tips a few more times on the scrap pieces of metal, I felt there was really no better time to just put my head down and give it a go. And so that's what I did. Yeah, I get it. I could hear all the comments already. It's rough, and I won't pretend it isn't, but it's undeniably functional. And maybe it's simply a placebo effect since I did it myself, but for someone who's got next to no experience welding, and even less experience welding upside down, I don't think it's terrible. Sure, some spots are really rough, but the plate definitely isn't going anywhere, and other than a couple spots on the plate itself, I didn't burn through the chassis even once. So all in, I'd say it was a halfway decent job. Now it still needed to be cleaned up, as you could see here. The mounting holes need to be level so the trailing arm bracket can sit flush to the body. And once it's all cleaned up, I'll be going over the entire area with paint to hopefully seal it off from any moisture. But overall, not much to complain about personally, and with what I learned on the first side, I was able to do an even better job on the driver's side. Unfortunately, I didn't get too many clips of this last little bit of weld work. At this point, the E36 had been at work for nearly 2 weeks, and I just didn't have the time to film everything and get the work done in a timely manner. So this is all I got. But after welding the reinforcement plate onto the driver's side, I started to feel more and more confident and decided it was worth it to go back over some of the spots on the passenger side, which ended up panning out really well. I was able to fill in a lot of the holes and clean up some of the areas that were really rough looking, and I'm sure in the process also beefed up that area even more than before the touch-up. So overall, the juice was worth the squeeze on that one. Now after grinding off and flattening everything out and letting the area cool overnight, I went back the next day and painted the pockets and finally was able to get the car off the lift and take it out for its first test drive. All right, so we are finally driving the car after 2 weeks of being at my work, and I kind of want to go over with you guys my thoughts and impressions with the new bushings in the rear, and also just, you know, if what we did kind of helped at all with any of the stuff that I mentioned earlier in the video, but also more importantly in last episode about kind of the hopping condition when really accelerating. So first of all, I do want to say that coming in and out of driveways and driving over bumps and stuff, that noise is gone. You know, the like really hard thumping noise. You guys saw just how bad the rear trailing arm bushings were. They were pretty much non-existent at that point. And now not only do we have the upgraded, you know, monoball bushings, but which is significantly more stiff than the OEM rubber ones. Even with that, The rear end thumping is gone, and so that's super awesome. And then as far as the hopping goes, I'm gonna let the car warm up a little bit before I really kind of get on it. But even just initial driving impressions, it feels a lot tighter. It feels a lot more like planted, and it, you know, the car feels very confident. Whereas before, you know, without even knowing the condition of the bushings, it just didn't feel as confident. And I know, you know, if you've been watching the channel for a while, I've done a few driving videos where I'm kind of out in back roads, really kind of giving it some sauce, and I'm keeping it within my capabilities, but also with what I feel is safe to do with the car. And even just driving it like it is right now, I feel a lot more confident with the car, because now, especially knowing what the bushings were like, but now the car feels better. It feels a lot more like dialed. It feels a lot more planted. Maybe I'm a little biased because the last couple rounds of mods have been pretty significant as far as changing the way the driving feel is between the two-way adjustable coilovers, and then now with the spherical bushings in the rear, the car feels a lot different than it did even just a month ago. So far, super stoked. I'm about to hop on the freeway here as soon as traffic clears up, and I'll let you guys know if that hopping condition is gone. I have a pretty strong feeling it's going to be. We'll find that out in just a second. All right, here we go. Gotta leave some room for the person in front of me. We're gonna come up on a light getting on the freeway. Please hold. Dude, it feels amazing, and absolutely no hopping that I could tell, at least compared to before. Before it was really obvious. Anytime you really got on the car, the rear end did not feel very confident, and I could happily say that that is taken care of now. So that, you know, rules out what I was thinking in last episode about it being an alignment or a coilover issue, which makes sense. You know, you guys saw the bushings. They were really, really, really rough and in need of replacement. And, you know, when you're putting load on a, you know, any car really, but a rear wheel drive car like this one, obviously the rear suspension is taking a lot of force. You know, it's dealing with a lot when you're doing that. And so I'm not surprised that those bushings pretty much being non-existent was, you know, making for that hopping condition. But yeah, super, super stoked. And like I was saying just a second ago before we did this, it feels really good. The car feels a lot more confident. I feel it feels a lot more like planted and dialed, if that makes sense. And like I was saying, obviously I'm coming from OEM suspension, worn bushings, to two-way adjustable coilovers and monoball bushings, pretty much all in the rear. And so, yeah, obviously pretty night and day difference, but overall super, super stoked. Kind of a little side tangent, but as far as like NVH goes, like everything I was reading says that like once you go stiff engine and trans mounts, you do like monoball bushings or poly bushings, like the NVH is like too crazy. And maybe I'm just jaded because all of my first cars ever were old like beater BMWs. Like my daily now is like my only like nice, comfortable daily car. But otherwise, all of my other cars ever for my entire, you know, driving life have been just kind of beaters. And so maybe I'm just used to the noise and the shakes and everything, and I don't know, but to me it's not crazy. It's not like my mind is melting, you know, my brain isn't leaking out of my ears because the noise is just too crazy. It feels like a streetable race car, essentially. Like it feels good. There's enough NVH, I guess, to where like it feels nice. Like, you know, it makes me feel like I'm driving a race car and not a daily. And so anyways, got off on a little tangent there, but the car feels super good. It feels rad to drive, and I'm excited to finish up the mods that I have left. We're getting really close to kind of closing out phase one of this track prep. Once I eventually get the car out to the track a few times and I kind of figure out where the car is lacking or what I can improve from that point on, we will kind of start phase two of doing mods to this car to further dial it in. And so anyways, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Hopefully you guys don't flame me too much for all the weld work. Like I said, it's my very first time doing any legitimate weld work, and it being on my own car does feel a little special. You know, it probably would have been done better if someone else had done it, but it's nice knowing that I was able to get that done. It was a very big hurdle that I had been putting off for a long time because I didn't want to pay someone else to do it. And so I'm glad that it's done and we can move on to whatever is next. So yeah, if you made it this far, I appreciate you guys checking it out, and I look forward to catching you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Peace.